Welcome everybody to this next part of the ESCoE conference, and particularly this COVID-19 panel session. It gives me great pleasure to chair this session. I think we're very fortunate to have a very international flavour actually to this session. We're going to focus a little bit on measuring the business impacts in real time and on an international experience. So we've got 4 speakers who we cover actually the whole of the globe, and we'll hear from them shortly. So we're going to focus a little bit about 20 minutes per talk. I hope that then leaves us enough time for some questions following that. I would encourage you to use the Q&A bar at the bottom of the screen. So if you look down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can ask a Q&A topic via that. And at the end of each talk, we'll look through those questions and pose them to the speakers. And we'll invite you to sort of then ask that question. I should say at the very end of the session, there's also the break lounge that if we don't get to your question, we can pick those topics up a bit later. You should also note that this session is being recorded as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Tom, who's going to talk about the Australian experience related to the COVID impacts. So I'll stop my video now and hopefully Tom will start us off.
I'm just waiting for the host to start my video. I can't seem to start it. So can you see my screen, Sarah?
Yeah,
no, we can see you, but not your screen.
How's that?
It's coming. Yes, we can see it now. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks for your patience. It's evening in Australia, but thanks for the opportunity all the same to share our experiences at this conference. Just by way of context, Australia's first COVID cases were confirmed towards the end of end of January. The case numbers noted here are actually from around mid-September. So in the international context, these are relatively low numbers, and the mortality rates are relatively low. And the deaths are mainly in the residents of aged care facilities. With that context, restrictions were progressively relaxed from around early May at the national level. However, states in Australia, the various states in Australia, could determine when they could, when they would actually implement some of the changes. However, more recently, we've had a second wave, and this has been mainly isolated to one state, with case numbers in that jurisdiction running at about 75% of the Australian numbers. So state-based lockdown has been imposed, and while at the same time restrictions are progressively being lifted in other jurisdictions. Also, the national borders remain closed, and there are some internal borders that are also closed, and that limits the movement of people within the country and obviously affecting some of the trade arrangements within Australia. It's against this backdrop that government has taken action with a $320 billion economic support package. And this is across the whole Australian financial system, the businesses, households, and individuals affected by the crisis. This is about 16% of GDP. The program has had a large take-up, over 900,000 organisations, around 3.5 million individuals. It has wide coverage. For example, I think it represents something in the order of 30% of private sector employment, and organisations and individuals supported in all sectors across all parts of the country. Besides the federal measures, the Australian government measures, there's also a range of other support measures that have been stood up by the states. And these are measures to do with state taxes, relief for state taxes, rental reliefs, that includes for landlords as well, waivers of licenses and registrations, subsidies for apprentices and trainees, some specific grants, and also interest-free loans. It's important to note that there are two key government support measures that is making up the large part of the subsidy program. One's called the JobKeeper wage subsidy, and the other one is the Boosting Cash for Employers subsidy. The JobKeeper is a support measure for businesses affected by the pandemic and subsidises the cost of wages for business employees. It is one of the largest fiscal and labour market interventions in Australia's economic history. The second measure, the Boosting Cash Flow for Employers subsidy, provides temporary cash flow support for mainly targeted at small and medium sized businesses and not-for-profit organisations. As you can see from the graphs, the two sectors that have been heavily impacted by government restrictions and changes in consumer behaviour had the highest take-up of the government support packages. And these are in the arts and recreational services and in the accommodation and food services. We also note that from other survey activity we've done, businesses that receive the cash flow boost mainly use it for two purposes. One is to support employee payments, and the second is to actually pay for some of the fixed business costs that they incur regardless of whether they're in operation or not, whether they're open for business or not. I just want to go to ABS's response, and the ABS quickly developed a suite of products to provide insights into Australia's experiences and to help with the government response. We had to make some changes to the normal ABS work program to create the space and to start these new initiatives. In doing that, we worked quite closely with our government policy agencies to shape the program, which meant actually trying to actually put delay some other work that we had in our work program of at this point in time lower priority. Another thing to note is, as part of this, we also needed to work with our big suppliers of data, in particular accessing a range of new data from our tax system, and more recently accessing bank transactions data from the big banks, and supermarket scanner data from the big supermarket chains. I must say that this highly collaborative approach from government and businesses stood up well in shaping the ABS's response. And you know, even from the private sector, there was really a strong willingness to actually help in whatever way they could, and we used that as the momentum to actually try and drive some new data sources, acquisition of new data sources. I'll now move to talking about the business surveys we have stood up as part of this response. So this survey is actually about understanding business confidence, business sentiments, and how businesses have been responding to changing conditions. Question content changes each month to respond to changing conditions. We continue to work closely with the key policy agencies to understand their needs and prioritize content for inclusion for each survey. I mean, this has been quite important because the agencies have had to implement policies quickly, and they're seeking, you know, us to be a bit more nimble in terms of how we actually go about measuring different aspects of what they've actually put in place. But that said, we continue to face the challenges of being able to juggle the requirements to provide insights on effectiveness of government policy versus measuring business conditions, which may require new government responses. So, you know, it's a little bit of the chicken, I suppose, and a little bit of the egg. Just looking at our journey with this survey, the early iterations of the survey were focused on initial impacts of COVID on the capacity of businesses to continue to operate. Further, you know, iterations of the survey looked at the impact of the stimulus packages on businesses, as well as seeking information about how businesses were changing the way they were going to operate. And moving on, the collection basically changes its focus on understanding some of the barriers to business survival, including access to finance, the ability to meet their financial commitments, and in a sense, how they're actually going to prepare themselves for what we think is going to be the new norm. So the rapid survey has applied standard business survey practices in a very constrained time frame. This is a phone interview based survey, and the results are released at least monthly. Having said that, we've been quite blessed to have we have a high quality business register that holds up-to-date contact information for businesses, and I think this is key to actually ensuring that we're able to track the businesses down, and this has been integral to our ability to achieve reasonably good response rates. I think producing the data quickly for key policy agencies, as I said earlier, has been critical, and we've got a range of outputs, standard outputs to do that. But we've also deliberately shifted our approach for the non-standard outputs to actually trying to make the data a bit more digestible to other audiences as well. For example, the results are also being presented in this sort of highly consumable format, allowing a broader range of users to easily interpret and draw insights from what is presented to them. Now, the survey itself is it's actually not produced in a vacuum. There are ongoing relationships between the information we collect from the survey and other ABS surveys. The responsive design provides the opportunity to collect additional information that helps provide insights to the other survey programs and other economic indicators as well. For example, we were able, just using this as an example, we were able to connect this survey with the ABS ongoing capital expenditure survey to provide insights into intentions and drivers of business capital expenditure. The questionnaire design for the collection has deliberately included opportunities for comment. We found that respondents have been very interested in engaging with the interviewers and providing additional information and insights into how the pandemic has impacted their business operations. And these have been really valuable from a number of perspectives, especially number one, understanding business sentiments as such, but also we've used some of that information to help shape future content in discussing some of the responses, you know, in the broad terms with the policy agencies. And also, I think we felt it was important to share the voices of these respondents through non-standard means of presenting the data. So I'll finish the presentation by noting a couple of things. First, the survey will continue for at least the remainder of the financial year. We've actually started to include some common content across the different waves so that we can actually now track business confidence as one indicator. And the last thing is we're looking at how we can, we're at least exploring these results, how they can be included in our business longitudinal data environment to enable linkages with other ABS business data. So once again, thanks for the opportunity to present at this conference, and happy to take questions now or towards the end. Thanks very much, Craig.
Great. Thanks, Tom. I think if I can start my video, there I am. Great. I'm just checking on the question and answer panel. Sumit, you had a question?
Yeah, sorry about that. It was a question on your communication practices. You had a slide there where you said that there has been change in how you've looked to communicate. And I think it was particularly around the format so that it was more digestible. And I think this was something I was really interested in because I guess this episode has kind of heightened just the broader appeal, kind of going beyond your typical stakeholders, you know, your policy departments or your forecasters, but much more to the public. So I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit on what you have done or what have you found most effective, what's the feedback been like, but also like what are the possible lessons learned from your more core kind of bulletins or production outputs. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question because, I mean, this is shock horror. You know, statisticians don't like presenting information like this, to be honest with you. So it took a bit of a change in attitude once they actually saw how consumable it was and how much it was reused by different audiences, and that includes the media. And really, I mean, this traditional tables and charts don't actually do the justice for the media in terms of actually providing good insight. So this was a lot more easier for them to digest, number one, write stories around. And it was incredible the amount of reuse that was made of just the graphics and, you know, the infographics and the numbers we had in those infographics. It certainly, we felt that from reaching a wider audience than our traditional analyst, it paid off huge dividends. Having said that, there's a lot of data that sits behind the scenes, obviously, with some of this information, and we were conscious that you know, the policy analysts required that data, and we were able to ensure that they continued to receive that in the traditional fashions as well. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, very much. That was really interesting. I think it's something we kind of face in the UK ourselves, that kind of dynamic, and as you say, it's kind of almost your traditional users and your non-traditional users, and kind of getting the mix of needs. So that's kind of really interesting insight and something kind of we're looking at ourselves in the UK. So thank you for that.
Yeah. I mean, it started off, to be very honest with you, it started off with, you can't do that, you know, you shouldn't do that, to one of, wow, we should be doing more of this. So it really takes on a life of its own, you know, when the momentum builds in terms of how it's actually digested, you know, by the audiences.
Thanks, Sumit, and thanks, Tom. I'm just, again, looking at the question and answer bar. I mean, I've I've got one from me, if I can use Chair's prerogative as well. You mentioned a little bit around the phone survey approach, at least in the UK. When we had quite a lockdown environment, we found contacting businesses who just weren't there at the place of sort of work, if you like, was very difficult. So I'm just wondering how you sort of managed that, or whether that wasn't an issue in the Australian context for actually just getting in touch with some of these firms.
Oh, it was very much an issue because you know, understanding whether they were dormant versus closed down versus, you know, temporarily, you know, out of station, whatever, was actually a very, very difficult and challenging task. Having said that, you know, we do also have access to email contacts. So that helped us enormously in terms of trying to update our contact details. And quite frankly, you know, a number of the organizations, and certainly in some of the sectors that I've noted earlier, a number of the contacts from those sectors were actually operating from outside the business environment. They were operating in their home environment, whether it was their accountants or chief operating officers or whatever. I think over time we've been able to stabilize, number one, the sample, but also to ensure that we had stable contacts. But certainly in the early phases, Craig, I don't think our experiences are any different.
No, thanks for that. I think the other one I sort of touched on as you went through the presentation was the data linking elements. And again, I suppose our experiences in the UK, where we've running sort of our similar surveys fortnightly, but we've started to think, well, how can we use that with our regular monthly outputs? And then that then perhaps lends itself to sort of, well, how could you perhaps sort of link or understand how some of these businesses are responding in the context of the wider sort of survey? So maybe if you could expand a little bit on that, I'd be interested as well.
Yeah, very early days into this. I don't think we've actually got the critical mass of data to understand whether we've got the right pool of data to link with other sources yet. I mean, with data linking, you know, it's always a case of, is it a solution to a problem, or is it a problem to a solution? You don't know yet until you actually start to actually work with a lot more data in the environment. And having three waves of data with the same sample doesn't give us enough sort of an indication of how we can actually use that, you know, in any degree of anger with the other stuff that we've got in the pool, in the data lake, so to speak. So I think it's early days, but we certainly gone in recently with that mindset to be able to do that down the track. At least with about 6 months of observations, we can start to look at how we can track business confidence with things like innovation, productivity, other outputs that we're actually getting from other survey programs.
Yeah, no, I understand all of those issues as well. So thanks. I'm just checking again the Q&A panel. It looks like there's no more open questions. So thanks, Tom, for that. And like I mentioned at the start, again, we'll find hopefully that at the end we might yet all join together in the panel and see if there's any more questions to pick up via that. So
okay, thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Tom. Looking next is going to be Rikke. I'm going to stop my video and pause myself and pass it over to Rikke. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Craig. It's a pleasure for me to present today. And let me just share my presentation here. Okay, do you see my presentation?
Yes, yep, I can see it.
Okay, yeah, thanks again, Craig. So what I will do is to present some perspectives from Asia and the Pacific. My name is Rikke Hansen, and I work in the United Nations Office for Asia and the Pacific, in short, ESCoE. what I will do is not to try to cover all of Asia and the Pacific. It's a very large region, including Australia, which we just heard from. But what I will do is to give a little snapshot on the kind of activities statistical institutions are conducting to assess impacts of COVID-19, and also some of the changes they're making to their statistical operations to ensure business continuity, and some of the related concerns. And I have put quite a few links in my presentation for those of you who might want to have a closer look after this session. So first, let me just give you an overview of what part of the world I'm talking about. In ESCoE, we work with 58 member countries in Asia and the Pacific. It ranges from Turkey in the west to the small Pacific islands in the east. It's a very heterogeneous, very diverse region. We have some of the most developed and some of the least developed countries in the world. It's home to 2/3 of the world's population. We have some of the very, very small countries of just 1,000 people, and we also have countries, giants like India and China in the region. So also when we look at what's happening during a pandemic like this, one issue that's worth noting also is digital connectivity, where we do have highly digitalized countries with very good connections, such as South Korea. And we also have some countries where, well, if physically people cannot get together, it is a real challenge to just conduct the basic statistical operations. So let me first give you a bit of an overview of, well, basically where you can find some of the information we just heard from Australia in terms of what kind of policy measures are in place, and how is it dispersed, how is it used. This is ESCoE's COVID-19 tracker you see on the screen, and you will see that there are options on the left here to look at different countries, both in terms of containment, fiscal policies, monetary policies, special measurements put in place for small and medium-sized enterprises, trade measures, transport, social protection, and then also statistics. And if you look at the statistics part here, you will see an overview of statistical responses to COVID-19 in Asia and Pacific, where as we receive the information or hear of it, we add it here and basically categorizes different examples from countries into COVID-19 related content on the website of the National Statistical Office, socioeconomic response surveys conducted, business vis-a-vis households. And you will see also here that we have examples both from the United Kingdom and the United States. And I don't know if our panel organizer today is aware of it, but the UK as well as the US are actually members also of ESCoE, although they are not geographically placed in the region. But let us try to zoom in on one example that can be found in this COVID-19 tracker. And I've just randomly picked here Bhutan. They have done a business-focused socioeconomic response survey to see the impact of COVID-19. So just to make sure everyone is aware here, Bhutan is a landlocked country, very small country in the eastern Himalayas. It has around 750,000 in terms of population. It's a place I highly recommend a visit once it's possible again. Now, what has happened in Bhutan is that there's been a total ban on international tourism since March, and this measure is expected to continue to be in place for quite a while still. Bhutan has also identified tourism as a particularly important sector and have already now 16% of the workforce employed in tourism. And this is why it was decided to focus one of the very first efforts to figure out what was really going on and what kind of impact people were seeing from COVID-19 is focusing on the tourism sector. And the survey was conducted rather quickly after the ban on foreign tourists came into force. So this was conducted already in the first half of April this year. Now, the purpose of the survey was to understand the impact of COVID-19 on tourism, both on businesses and the individuals employed in the sector, and also understand the vulnerability and coping capacity of affected individuals. Now, Bhutan is a least developed country, so obviously one of the main concerns is to get a sense of how many people are likely to fall into the category of being poor. And this is why the vulnerability and coping capacity was in the absolute focus of this assessment. Now, the assessment covered 5 districts in Bhutan, including the 2 most touristy provinces, Thimphu, the capital, and Paro. It covered 9 subsectors of the tourism industry, such as hotels, tour operators, airlines, handicraft, etc. The sample size was 1,320 with a very high response rate, and this was conducted through phone interviews. If we look at the results, it's quite stunning considering how fast after or how quickly after the lockdown this survey was conducted. At this point in time, already 32, a third of the employees had lost their job or had been sent home without pay. 17% of the affected households had no savings or other means of subsistence. And I should add that a majority of the affected households had the income from tourism as the sole source of income. 87% of the business owners had debt, and almost half of them indicated that they could not pay their next monthly installment on their loans. Now, if we look particularly at the results that related to vulnerability, the survey was designed to capture a multidimensional index on this, and you can see here on the slide the different aspects covered, such as income loss, food security, indebtedness, etc. And the survey also found that more than 80% of the respondents were deprived in at least 3 of these indicators simultaneously. So moving from a very specific example of a rapid assessment survey, let me give some broader view of what statisticians are doing and what they're worried about in Asia and the Pacific. And one of the things that we do at the United Nations is to facilitate the exchange of information on these kind of things, exchange knowledge so that countries can learn from each other. And during the past 6 months, almost now, we've organized a large number of dialogues in the region. And this slide shows an overview of some of the typical topics and concerns or main issues of discussion. The meetings I refer from here is, the first one is a meeting of the Asia Pacific Committee on Statistics. It is a United Nations committee, and all the chief statisticians from the region are members of this committee. And it met less than a month ago, We also have a group of economic statisticians, typically heads of economic statistics departments, that work together to improve economic statistics in Asia and the Pacific. And they've put together a regional program. The steering group for this program met in June and of course had COVID-19 also on the agenda. And what we can see from the conversations is that everyone is saying, well, there is a large increased demand for good and for bad for economic and financial statistics, trade statistics, tourism statistics, price statistics, employment statistics, etc. And everyone is also saying, well, we are changing the way we collect data. It's such that a very large number of statistical offices are still mainly relying on personal interviewing for their surveys, and the shift to phone surveys has been accelerated because of the pandemic, and of course it means a lot of adjustments needed in the statistical business process. Now on the positive side, there is a very large momentum for modernizing data dissemination, as we just heard Tom talk about. A momentum also for using new types of data. And that's of course forced upon all of us as part of the effort to produce more timely statistics. Statisticians in the region, in Asia and the Pacific, see opportunities for new partnerships, for example, the holders of some of these new data types, and an opportunity to get new customers simply because the interest for data, both on the economy, but certainly on many other things, has just risen worldwide during the past 6 months. And finally, on the more concerned side, well, the increased demand for training comes up again and again. Can we get some training on how, in particular, how to ensure business continuity in times like these? And then a concern related to what you might call the shift in quality dimensions of priority. We see a lot of effort and focus on relevance, timeliness, and frequency at the moment. And the concern here is, of course, well, is this at the cost of accuracy? And is that, are we striking the right balance between these different quality dimensions of the statistics we produce? So from the broad dialogues, let me go to a series of more specific dialogues that we are organizing on a very regular basis, once every week or every fortnight. We are organizing what we've called the Asia Pacific Stats Cafe. And these are very well visited 1-hour sessions of a topic that relates in most cases directly to COVID-19. It is our replacement, since we haven't been able to meet physically for quite a while now. But on average, we have around between 30 and 40 countries participating in these cafes. So around 150 people every time. You can see on this slide the topics we've covered. The last one, number 13, was held earlier today, and we had almost 300 people listening into 1 hour interesting discussion on data integration. The one I've picked to talk a little bit more about now is the second of these stats cafes. It was held back in June, and that was particularly on rapid assessment surveys. And this is the overview of that particular stats cafes. We use MS Teams for these things. It's an open invitation also to people not based in Asia and the Pacific. If you can live with the time zone, you're very, very welcome to tune in. All the sessions are also recorded and available online. And some of you might recognize some of the people on this picture here. For this particular Stats Cafe, the aim was really to exchange experiences and lessons from conducting rapid assessment surveys. It was covering both households and businesses. And we had speakers from Australia, Thailand, and the International Labour Organization and the World Bank. So instead of trying to give an overview of what was actually presented, let me just give a few snapshots on the kind of questions that were asked. In terms of design issues for rapid surveys, how do we ensure coverage of the businesses? How do we include the informal sector? Is such that quite a large number of countries, of the less developed countries in Asia Pacific, have an estimated informal sector of around 50% of economic activity. And other questions were for countries that do not have a good statistical business register, of which there are many. What's the advice when we want to conduct rapid surveys of businesses? What modes of collection are being used? Phone surveys, we just covered that in some of the questions to Tom earlier, but the challenges that he listed came up as questions in this Stats Cafe as well. And this idea of mobile phones, fixed line phones, etc., was part of the questions asked. Sample sizes, as always, was a question. What about non-responses? What about making sure that we assure confidentiality when sample sizes get rather small? And this is a challenge in particular in small countries, including in the Pacific. So finally, what I'll do is just end on an appeal for those people in the audience today who might be also involved in supporting developing countries with their statistics. We receive calls over and over again from national statistical offices in Asia and the Pacific, complaining that now there's another international agency partnering up with a private sector company and doing a survey without involving the National Statistical Office. So I'll just forward this appeal to the audience today and also alert you to another product of ESCAP's, which is the Stat Brief. It's another series. It's also available online, and this particular Stats Brief is exactly about the collaboration between statistical offices and development partners. So on that note, I'll finish, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Rikke. I've successfully added my video back on, so no, thank you for that. I've got a couple of questions, but I'll throw it open again to the Q&A panel. And I would encourage for participants to use that down the bottom of the bar as well. But Sumit, I can see you've got a question. If you could, someone could unmute you, that would be great.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the talk. That was really interesting. There was one topic you kind of raised. It was on the slide where you kind of picked out the most cited kind of topics that people were speaking about. And one was on, I guess, potentially the trade-off or the balance between the relevance, timeliness, frequency and accuracy of kind of wide range of indicators. And it was one that was raised earlier today. And I'd be interested in either your views or any emerging views that you're getting from some of the partner organizations. So I imagine this is one of the, I don't want to say tensions necessarily, but I guess one of the balancing acts that we've got to find. And I guess maybe it's that balance between official estimates and some survey information you talk about. But any insights you had in that would be really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question because I don't think it has an answer. This will have to be an always ongoing discussion, yeah, because the right balance between these quality dimensions, of course, will depend on the purpose of the statistics that's being produced. there is, as I mentioned, there is a lot of concern saying, well, how can we assure the accuracy? But I see a shift in terms of saying, well, maybe as statisticians, we have for too many years equated accuracy and quality, and we have not placed enough emphasis on the other quality dimensions. And I think we see a very good illustration this year that, well, a lot of statistics, if we have to wait a month, then it's worthless. It may be more accurate, but no one is going to use it. And then it's worthless. So I see a shift. And I think I can't get an answer that's more accurate than that. Yeah, thanks. Good question.
It was a good answer as well.
Thank you, Craig.
So, thanks. Another one has popped in. This is, I'll read this one out as well. It's someone sort of written the question here. Are there any tensions between the type of statistics being preferred or prioritized in the certain countries? So for example, do you see developing countries in general focusing more on the economic impact over health, or indeed the other way around? So thanks for that interesting question for whoever submitted that. Thank you. Rikke, if you have you got that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't say tensions. I would, in terms of, you know, do we produce too much health statistics all of a sudden, or if all the policy response is focused on the economy, are we then seeing too much economic statistics? What I find, if we should look for attention, is that there is quite a few people very, very concerned that in all the frenzy to respond both health-wise in terms of health statistics as well and economic statistics, that we forget the environment, which is something many statistical institutions have worked very hard to even get started on the past decade or so. And we hear concerns from newly established environment statistics unit, which often initially start as a little subunit within the national account section. For example, if they are embarking on environmental economic accounts, that they are forgotten a bit at the moment. So I would rather say that if there is a concern or a tension, it's more on that, let's say, third dimension in addition to the economy and people, that the environment may be losing out here. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I think it's tricky, isn't it? I guess I know within the United Kingdom context, when we're running some of these surveys, it's, you know, there's a respondent burden element as well, but there's also about who is filling these surveys in and how and what information do they know, you know, off the top of their head, if you like, to sort of respond in a way that can sort of help us answer those type of questions. And when it's such a broad sort of topic base, it's very challenging, I think, for respondents and sort of businesses and individuals actually to have that information. But
and maybe I can just add there, Craig, that if we talk about incentives, that might shift people's responses a bit. I think we also are at in very special times. Let's put it that way.
That's exactly right. And I think it sort of was going to lead me on to, I had a question around, to use again the chair's prerogative on this, about the coordination element. I was sort of wondering how, you know, the interface there actually covered a lot of countries. I mean, how have you found that from sort of the global dimension, if you like, about collecting this information from these NSIs in these particular places?
Well, I would say that one of the one of the best tools that we have in a place like ESCAP, covering so many countries, is a very, very extensive network, particularly among the chief statisticians. They all know each other and they know us. And that's for me, I mean, this is the first go-to place if I need some information. And just the fact that you know who to call makes things much, much easier. Now, if we want to get people around a table or a Zoom call to talk, that's pretty easy. Where it may get a little more challenging is when we want to collect written information about experiences or specific surveys, or maybe the methodology. One thing is that there may be a certain reluctance to write down things you may not be totally certain about, or may have done twice as fast as what you normally do, and maybe you're not totally certain. So you would also see the COVID-19 tracker I showed. The list of examples is relatively short when we look at the statistics examples. But in addition to that, we are of course also operating in a region with not only different languages, but also different scripts. And one of the limitations we certainly see at the moment is that we rely more and more on exchanges in English only, because it is just a challenge electronically, and this puts a damper on this. Yeah, thanks.
No, thanks for that. I'm looking at the Q&A panel. I can't see any other more questions, but I suppose my last one was on the Stats Cafe. I mean, I did set my alarm early one day, and I joined one of them recently. So I think, like you say, the network around this is extremely important. So obviously where you're covering a lot of topics, the benefit to that for those attendees and actually making those connections is vital, isn't it?
It's vital. And one thing is, well, I can say, well, the Stats Cafes, yes, they are well visited, but I actually think, and I hope, that the main impact of these Stats Cafes is that people continue the chat afterwards, either bilaterally or in groups, because it is a great way to get to know each other. And I actually find that the questions asked during these Stats Cafes are probably more informative than the presentations that are given. And if I want to know something about a topic, I look at who's been asking questions about that topic, and that's the person I want to get hold of. Yeah. Yeah, but please come back, Craig.
No, that's exactly right. I think sharing and learning off each other is really important, particularly when we're all tackling similar topics as well. So thanks very much. I can't see any more Q&A on the slide bar. So thanks Rikke for your presentation. That leads us on to Cathy, who's next as well. So I'll now mute myself and pass it over to Cathy. Thanks again.
Okay. I'm just going to take a second to share my screen. Oh, sorry. Okay. So I originally was going to say good afternoon, but I realize now that there are people all over the world, so I'll just say hello. My name is Cathy Buffington, and I am the survey director for the United States Census Bureau's Small Business Pulse Survey. I realized too, at the beginning of the session, that a lot of people might not know about the United States federal statistical system. So we are a federated system. There are 13 principal statistical agencies, and the Census Bureau is the largest. And from our branding, you'll see that we do our population census, but we also have in our mission measuring the US economy. So we do an economic census as well as over 100 different surveys. We produce products using administrative records on businesses and households. So just to give an overview. One of the things that has struck me with the past two talks is that the overlap between our experiences is remarkable. When the United States went into a state of national emergency on March 13th, we recognized that we needed to do something in terms of measuring the situation that businesses found themselves in, and the Small Business Pulse Survey was conceived. We decided to focus on small single location employer businesses, both because they were somewhat easy to reach as opposed to multi-location businesses that perhaps operate over different geographies, but also because they're an important constituency. Many federal programs focus on small businesses. We decided to do a weekly survey. It turns out we've done these over 9 weeks, over 2 different phases. And we needed to produce high frequency data on the core operations of small businesses as well as on their finances. But we also wanted to include topical or evolving concepts related to the pandemic. We selected a very large sample in advance of conducting the survey. We knew we wanted to produce geographically detailed as well as industry detailed data. And we were really uncertain about the response rate to our survey. I know that Tom had mentioned that having highly consumable data was a goal of the ABS's efforts, and we too felt that a highly usable interactive website as well as a complete data download for all of our tabular data were very important to increase the usability of the collection. We did this as a proof of concept when we received stay-at-home orders in March. This included everyone at our processing center. Typically, the Census Bureau mails a letter on official letterhead with an official-looking envelope, and that's how we contact businesses. Because our processing center was closed, we had to resort to an email-only based survey, which was novel for us. And this is also our first weekly survey ever. So these were definitely proof of concepts and capabilities for us to acquire. We decided to release the data products under our experimental designation, meaning that the products may not meet some of our statistical quality standards. In particular, ahead of starting the survey, we did believe that we would have a lower response rate than is required by our standards. Much like others experience, we leveraged subject matter experts at other agencies across the federal government. In the US, we have a Small Business Administration that provided us with information about programs and metrics on those programs that would be useful for them as they are the administrators of those programs. And we also work with other agencies, including the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, who use our data to closely monitor the economy. Last, we leveraged existing internal resources. That is, we took people off of existing projects or had them continue to work on their existing projects while standing up the survey. Just briefly, I wanted to note that we developed the Small Business Pulse Survey in about 30 days, in about a month. We conceived of the project at the beginning of, or 2/3 of the way through March, about 10 days after we got our stay-at-home order. And within 2 months, we had highly detailed data published. There was a lot of schedule overlap, and it was a rapid development. We did a lot of work in parallel, including planning for our second phase, kind of in the middle of producing our first phase. So I noted that for the Small Business Pulse Survey, we leveraged existing resources. We used our in-house survey instrument and collection systems to rapidly develop an online instrument. We reused existing servers, Oracle servers and databases for our back-end processing, and we used high charts for rapid web development. We did have an email-only contact strategy, so no paper, which allowed us to continuously operate. So on Sundays, we mail out our email invitations. A reminder of the due date email is sent on Wednesday. The survey closes out on a Saturday, and we publish data on a Thursday, and those are all sort of overlapping within the 9 weeks. For our survey frame, we conducted a census, economic census in 2017. And from those businesses that participated, we selected all single location businesses with fewer than 500 employees and at least $1,000 in revenue. And key to this was they also needed to report an email address. From that group, we have about 1 million small businesses, and we split them into groups of randomly of about 100,000 over each of 9 weeks. And we do these in phases. So we did a phase 1 beginning in April, from late April to late June. And we took a break and we resumed, I think, August 9th, and we'll run through October 10th in the second phase. And we are reusing our target population over the 2 phases. These 1 million businesses are representative of about 5.6 small businesses in the United States. Because this was our first email-only survey, we are very interested in the metrics around email and response. And so this first figure shows you, the blue line represents the number of businesses that actually opened the email that they received on Sunday. The yellow line represents the email reminder that is mailed on Wednesday and the number of businesses that open that. And then the green line beneath that is the actual number of businesses that respond to the email survey, the email invitation to the survey. So about 52,000 businesses in total open the initial email, and it's somewhere in the 40s open the reminder. And each week, this is a pretty typical week, we receive about between 20 and 22,000 responses to the invitations. Because email is a new platform for us, we had to develop all new metrics. Conversion rate was one of them. So the conversion rate is the kind of the likelihood that you'll respond to the survey, conditional on actually opening any of the emails. And this is sort of net of emails that bounce. So there was some wonkiness going on in the first couple of weeks of the survey. But the conversion rate has sort of settled down to about 38%. So we also capture a weekly response rate, and sort of you can see the Sunday to Saturday cadence of the survey. And what you'll notice, though, although the conversion rate for our survey is pretty constant at about 38%, you can notice the trend of a declining response rate overall. And sort of the blue lines are the first phase of our survey, the first 9 weeks, and then the orange lines are the second phase. So there are several reasons that this could be happening. One, I noted that we do reuse our target population kind of between the first phase and the second phase. So it could be that boredom has set in, survey fatigue, and businesses are no longer interested in responding. It could also be that they're confused, that they see the second email and don't bother to open it, thinking that they've already participated in the survey and it's yet another reminder. It could also be the immediacy of the problems associated with the pandemic, right, has lessened. That in April and May, people had a high degree of uncertainty about what was happening in the economy and to their business, and were more likely to participate in a federal survey to provide feedback. And now that this has sort of become more routine, it's less interesting or less important to them to participate in the survey. And then finally, the thing that I think in some ways worries me the most is that what we're seeing is businesses exiting permanently, that they're no longer in business and therefore no longer opening their email or participating in surveys. Nope. So just briefly, I wanted to talk about the content. We've conducted 2 phases, and in both phases, we asked questions that are qualitative, generally speaking, in nature. So increase, decrease, stay the same, 5-point Likert scales, that sort of thing. We stuck to qualitative type questions, or easy to answer questions, questions that don't require accessing business records. We focused on keeping the survey short, about 5 minutes, and the instrument itself was optimized to be answered, say, on a smartphone. For us trying to understand the data that we receive, we constructed the survey in each phase to have a narrative style so that we could kind of understand the story of what's happening to businesses. And we focused on sort of grouping questions into 5 concepts. The survey starts and ends with subjective questions, one about the overall effect of the pandemic on your business. And it closes with a question about your expectations or how much time until your business returns to normal. In between these 2 subjective bookend questions, we have questions on the operations of the business, questions that focus on revenues, employees, change in employee hours and temporary closures. We ask about challenges to the business. In the first phase, we asked about pivoting to new goods or services or pivoting to curbside carryout or delivery modes, as well as supply chain disruptions. And we ask finance questions. So questions about liquidity, loan or other payment defaults, and then requests for and receipt of assistance. And this is where federal programs or other programs have been developed for small businesses where we record that data. In the second phase, we kept to the narrative structure, and we did try to maintain, especially for questions around operations and finances, kind of the core questions that would allow us to monitor the business conditions over time in a way that was comparable. For challenge, we did add questions about the rehiring of laid off or furloughed employees, whether or not people were, businesses were offering more or less hours worked from home, and whether or not businesses had changed their use of online platforms to offer goods or services. We dropped the 2 pivot questions as they seem to be concentrated in select industries and were fairly not a lot of variation there. And we dropped those to add additional questions about business capacity changes and future needs. We added a few other federal programs that had been introduced since. And in our expectations question, we allowed for businesses returning to normal or permanently closing. So the next few slides are just to give you an idea of what our tool looks like and what some of the questions and responses look like. It's by no means exhaustive. So the first question shows that since the beginning of the collection in April, over 50% of businesses said that the pandemic had had a large negative effect, 50% of small businesses in the United States. And what we've seen pretty much across sectors and states is the share of businesses reporting a large negative effect has dropped over time. And so now nationally, it's just over 30%. And a third of businesses still is a remarkable number of businesses to have endured this large negative effect. One of the things about national data, though, is it does hide a lot of sectoral detail. So I know Australia, Tom's presentation had the same thing. For accommodation and food services in the end of April, over 80% of small businesses reported having a large negative effect on their business. And that's only dropped to just over 60%, about 65%. So our national numbers don't tell the whole story. The website offers maps of all of our questions and responses. You know, if you're not familiar with the United States geography, we have here all 50 states as well as the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. The question here is whether or not you furloughed or laid off any employees since the beginning of the declaration of a national emergency. And you can see from looking at the changes in colors and the difference in shades that the effect of the pandemic on small businesses in terms of layoffs has a differential in terms of geography. And so states in the middle and the south of the country had far fewer layoffs than those kind of on the coast. So this can be a result of the mix of industries that are in these states, and it can also be a result of differential coronavirus caseloads and or state level restrictions on business openings. And the Pulse survey also has a scatter plot tool that allows you to map out the answers to different questions and allows you to explore whether or not there may be linear relationships between those. So you'll see on the x-axis here that I've mapped out whether or not your business has an operating capacity change of 50% or more, and on the y-axis, a decrease in revenues in the last week. And it should come as no surprise that in the upper right quadrant that businesses in educational services and accommodation and food services have experienced both a higher than average share of operating capacity decreases as well as decreases in revenue. And just more generally, you can see that there is a positive relationship between a decrease in your business's capacity and a decline in revenues. The Pulse survey also has a detailed survey response bar graph that allows you to compare all of the response bins for a given question in a given week by city, by state, or by industry. So just briefly, this is whether or not you've missed any payments, and overwhelmingly businesses typically have not been defaulting on loans or other payments in the US, but it does vary both by industry and geography. And so here you'll see that over 25% of businesses in the New York metropolitan statistical area have indeed missed other payments. Last, I'm going to wrap up in terms of visualizations with our index, our expected recovery index. Because we ask a lot of questions with multiple bins, for many of them, we have constructed indices that allow us to represent kind of in a scalar number all of the response bins for a certain question. And so here you'll see that, again, New York, just typically if you're a business in New York, you have a much lower than nationally averaged expectations of time to recovery. I just wanted to wrap up and maybe prompt some questions by talking about some of the limitations and the challenges in the Small Business Pulse survey. Our initial survey design was constrained initially by our schedule and our resources. You know, we tried to get something out quickly, and so we used what we had in terms of the ability to contact businesses by email. And so we know that an area we could improve is to work on getting additional email coverage for more businesses, for different kinds of businesses. As you see from the conversion rate, we also know that the responsiveness to email invitations is an issue. Something like, I don't know, half of businesses aren't possibly opening the emails, and there are trust issues around that. So having businesses trust that it is the Census Bureau and is an actual survey, a legitimate survey, is an issue. I touched on briefly that there may be survival bias or selection bias in our estimates. Right? We know that a very small number of businesses that have closed are responding. I think it's less than 5%. But there are probably many of those that don't respond to our email invitations that have closed. And so all of the good things like the economy improving that we see in terms of, say, revenues in our survey are probably biased upwards because we've lost the business exits, and all of the things that tell us, you know, that there's still problems like constrained capacity or supply chain problems is probably understating the actual problem because, again, businesses have exited. Now, I'll note that planning future content during an emergency has proven to be very difficult, even with a very short time horizon between the time that we initiate the phase and to the time we go into collection. Things can change. And I think the questions on pivoting to other goods and services and the ability to switch to takeout, carry out, and delivery kind of are indicative of that, right? By the time we got those in the field and wrapped up a 9-week survey, those just weren't at the forefront of people of what businesses were doing. And in fact, in the US, many states had started rolling back their stay-at-home orders and opening businesses. Likewise, related to that, anticipating policy changes that may impact the relevance of the content is an issue, and it does underscore the importance of working with other agencies. And last, I will say that working on a weekly data release where you are overlapping collection and production all at the same time has been really challenging. Staffing that is challenging. We have people working nights and weekends. And so, it's really hard for the staff. So with that, I'm going to, I could leave my contact information and try to get my camera back on. Nope.
Thanks, Cathy.
Yep, I'm still going to work on the. You go ahead, Craig. I'm going to still try to get my camera back on.
No, not a problem. I always find the geographical impacts really interesting. I think that must, obviously, from a policy dimension, that must be really helpful to have it at that level. We've got a few question and answer questions in the panel, so we can address some of those now. I think for the one that's for the panel more generally, I'd like to keep that to the end. We're well in time, so I think for that question, if we can keep that for when we hear from Soren, and we'll bring all the panel members back for that. But if I can pass it to Tony now to talk about the incentives ones, if Tony could be unmuted, please.
Tony doesn't seem to be on the call anymore, so maybe you could ask it, Craig. Thank you.
Not a problem. So Tony's question was, what incentive is used? Do respondents get a feedback report or other incentives?
So we do, at least at the end of our first 9-week survey, we did send kind of a thank you email and direct them to the site with all of the visualizations. I think we'd always like to do more. We're open to ideas, but we do acknowledge the receipt. And then in the second phase, right, to try to counter the problem of kind of having to reuse our target population, we did spend a fair amount of time working with our writing staff to try to motivate the importance of participating and again, kind of pointing them to the data that was already collected and the need to collect more data to assist policymakers in providing aid to businesses.
Okay,
so.
Thanks. If I can ask Lara to come in with her question. Lara looks like she's still on mute at the moment. Perhaps I'll read it out then if the mic's not working. But Lara's question was about the lag between the data finished to be processed and by the time it's released to the public.
So I can tell you that we close out our survey at about, I think, 4 or 5 p.m. on Saturday. And it is all processed and ready to be reviewed on Monday morning. And so I review the data, and then we sort of stage it on Wednesday afternoon. We review it with our associate director for economic programs. We stage some tweets, we get it all lined up. We have a summary report written, and it goes out on 10 o'clock on Thursday mornings. And so by Thursday morning, we've already been collecting for the current week for 4 days. So it is kind of a tiled schedule. It's tiring. It's very tiring. So, but we think there's value in collecting weekly data, especially at the start of the pandemic when things were so rapidly changing, both shutting down and reopening.
No, I think from a UK perspective, we have similar challenges, if you like, between the overlap between the collection and then the rapid publication of these estimates, which is sort of the value of doing these surveys. Is like you say, with things changing so rapidly, you know, even a 2 to 3 week period, if there's a lag in that, you sort of want to capture, I guess, the dynamics of how it evolves. Sumit, if you could ask for Sumit to come in on the on the sort of direct question, but perhaps again we'll leave the one for the panel for after Soren's talk as well.
Thanks, Craig, and thank you, Cathy, for that. It was really interesting. There's one slide you show. You don't have to bring it up. It was on the response rates, and I think you're showing. I think you cite a number of around. I think it's 38% of like a conversion rate of those businesses that you'd emailed. And I was just kind of wondering where that fitted relative to your prior expectations. Was it above expectations, below, broadly in line? Because it seemed like a really high figure, given it was a brand new survey. So I'm just interested in your views on that.
So I actually want to tip my hat to the ONS when we were in the conceptual phase and the planning phase for the survey. We actually looked at the ONS's response rate to their survey. And I think at the time in the early days, it was, I don't know if it was upwards of 15% or higher. And so we actually used that as our target. So initially when we got a 25% response rate in the first phase, we were very happy. Again, though, you know, with 100,000 businesses per week, it allows for us to create national level statistics with a fair degree of precision, I guess. I'm not a statistician, so I want to be careful what words I use, but I think in terms of quality, in terms of standard errors, we were happy. But 25% is well below what we typically require of official statistics. I think 60% is that threshold, and anything below that typically triggers like a bias study, right, to understand what's going on with non-response. So it's sort of, I loved Rikke's answer about the need to focus on things maybe other than response rate during an emergency. But typically that would be far, far below. And I'll note too that the Census Bureau has sort of two classes of surveys, sort of those that are mandatory by law for businesses to fill out, and then those that are voluntary. And so for a voluntary email survey, I think 25% exceeded our expectations.
Yeah, I was just going to add in there as well. I think in a UK context, we're also a voluntary survey as well, and we're now, I think it's hitting around the 20-25% response. So that's maybe a validation of that level of response for something that's a voluntary survey as well. But, I see the last couple of questions that we have in the Q&A box are more ones for the panel. So I propose we come back to those at the end of Soren's talk, and that leads us quite nicely, if I can pass over to Soren as well. So thanks again, Cathy.
Thank you, Craig.
Thank you, Craig, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share with you our experience on experimental statistics. Now I will share my screen with you. And I hope that you can see it now. When we had the national order by the government to stay home, it was, as in many other parts of the world, a very big change. And we saw this as an opportunity to really make a push forward on something we have been talking about for a long time, about experimental statistics. And so we really focused on that and brought some new products. Also, it meant that we could have access to some new data sources we have been talking about for some while that we would like to use. And during this time of crisis, there was really a very positive cooperative spirit among many parts of society, including our external partners. And that gave us really a boost in this area. And now here in the later phases of the crisis, on the second wave, you could say, we now have a focus on the possibilities for retaining access to these new data sources. At Statistics Denmark, we have communicated experimental indicators within a number of domains during the COVID crisis. They are available at our website through the link in the bottom of this slide. I must admit that the material I will show to you is mostly in in Danish. But I will explain the key aspects and the results to you. If you should afterwards be interested in knowing more, there is for each indicator a link to a contact person, and you're of course welcome to contact us on these matters. Also, the link you will see in the bottom of this slide, there is a shorter English description of the material, and there's a video on YouTube where you can access, where you can see a short video of explaining about our experimental statistics. In this presentation, I will inform you about the indicators related to business, foreign trade, and transport statistics, and I will both explain the nature of the experiments and show you some of the results. Straight after the sudden lockdown of a number of industries, we decided to add extra questions to our monthly business climate sentiment survey. Those were questions about to which extent enterprises were affected by domestic and foreign political restrictions on their activities. Secondly, to which extent their turnover was affected by the COVID situation. And finally, the likelihood that the business would remain in business within the next 3 months. And here in the later phases of the crisis, we retain this last question. Here on this slide, we see the most recent results from August. Now, having in mind that this is a service sector crisis, we see here that 1/3 of the travel agencies, they answered that it is very likely that they will, that they cannot survive the next 3 months. And for the services sector as a total, it's just a few percent, but it's in the accommodation and tourism industries, the numbers are really, really high. So this was an example where we had added questions to an existing survey. Now, the second example I will show is where we have made earlier release of totals from an ongoing survey. So here we see results from our survey of in the manufacturing sector about the industrial production and turnover. The figures shows a deepening of the crisis with a 7% drop from February to March in industrial production and a 12% drop from June to July this year, with the comparison to the corresponding developments in 2019. So where we saw that in the beginning, the crisis was not so much affecting the Danish manufacturing sector, we saw that this was actually deepening during the months of the summer of 2020. Now, if we then take a look at the exports, we see here an example of a new use of an existing data source, which is the customs declarations for trade with industries outside the European Union, which we receive on a daily basis. The gray columns we see here are the exports for each day this year. The blue curve is the 7-day moving average for 2019, and the red curve is the results for 2020. As we see, there's not a very big difference yet, but we follow very closely the Danish exports, not least to the United States. Then, if we look at an example of the use of big data to perform an experiment with, we have used satellite positioning data to look into the arrival of cargo ships into Danish harbors. As some of you may know, sea transport is very important to the Danish economy. The blue curve is a 7-day moving average for 2019, and the red curve is for 2020. What we see is that during most of the time since March, activity has been lower than last year, but with no stable pattern in the figures. Then, if we look at an example of an experiment to assess the business activity with a new and complex data source, we have used data on electricity usage. Since the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, we have gotten access to the so-called smart meter data on electricity consumption, and those are data points where we, on an hourly basis for each establishment and also each household, have data on their electricity consumption. So both this data source is both highly complex and also of a very, very high volume. The figures on the slides show index values where the green curves are for 2019 and the blue ones are for 2020. As we see, the examples on the left-hand side of the slide show the very significant slowdown in industries such as hotels, restaurants, tourism industries, and personal services, especially during the spring, whereas in later months, it is catching up again, and we see that the economic activity became close to normal in over the summer. Then, as an example of a new data source of a much more simple nature, we have around Easter time gotten access to data from the Danish courts on filings for bankruptcy. Of course, we've had bankruptcy statistics for many, many years on the declared bankruptcy, but having access to the data on the filings for bankruptcy was a big help, because also the courts were working at reduced capacity because of the COVID during the spring. So the number of declared bankruptcies was obviously misleading. So here we see on this graph the development in the actual numbers on a weekly basis. That's the development since the beginning of 2018. The filings we see in the green curve and the declared bankruptcies in the blue curve. As we see, there's not yet actually an increase in filings or declarations of bankruptcies. And this may say something about the effectiveness of the political compensation schemes for the enterprises being in trouble because of the political restrictions due to the pandemic. Then we looked into also how the crisis affected the establishing of new active enterprises. That we're able to do on the basis of the administrative registers available to us. The actual number of new active enterprises went down by around 30% during spring compared to 2019. And interestingly, the slowdown is among incorporated enterprises, which we see in the green curve here, while the number of personally owned enterprises, that is new personally owned enterprises, in the blue curve remains more or less the same. So during the summer, the situation seemed to be slowly getting back to normal. But now here with the second wave of the pandemic, the situation may change again. As example of indicators where we have mainly communicated data and indicators produced by other government agencies with whom we cooperate, we see at this slide index values for road traffic in 2020 compared with the corresponding week in 2019. So what we look at here are results of data being collected by automated meters being put up in traffic, different places in the traffic in the Danish society. As we see, mainly the blue curve, which represent transport with family vehicles, dropped significantly in the spring, whereas goods transportation was affected to a much lesser extent. It also shows that by July, things were almost back to normal. We see that, for instance, the fact that many people were working from home during the spring reduced the traffic on the roads to a significant extent, a very significant extent even. And that is, of course, the pattern that has been seen many other places also. Then if we look to an example of an indicator produced on the basis of open data, we see in this example the number of daily departures from Copenhagen Airport. As we see, it was for 3 months down by approximately 95%, and it is still at an extremely low level even today. And this has resulted in the loss of many hundreds of jobs in the air traffic industry. Then, as I mentioned, there have been these government compensation schemes. And one of the reasons why we have not yet seen an increase in bankruptcies is probably because of these compensation measures. We receive on a weekly basis the detailed microdata on the different compensation schemes from the government authorities that administers these schemes. And then we combine them with background data from our registers, both of persons and business units respectively. And then of course we also link the data because we know where every employee works physically. So we can put these information together. More than 20% of private enterprises with employees, they have received COVID compensation from the government schemes, especially in the services sector, of course. The blue column we see on this example shows that the majority of the enterprises that have received the compensation, they are small businesses with less than 10 employees, and to a very limited extent, it has been larger businesses. In the green curve, we see the distribution of jobs that have been compensated among enterprises of different sizes. These distributions can, of course, be made by all types of analysis approaches. We have also looked into the different types of jobs that have been compensated, and also the distribution of employees that have been sent off, and then as people are getting back to jobs or going out and being unemployed, we will look into how the social differences are there. We see that it seems that there is a majority of people with lower education, elderly people in the older parts of the workforce that seem to may have a difficulty getting back to their jobs or getting back to the labor market. Then, of course, we also make all these data on the government compensation schemes available to researchers in an anonymized form, so that the academia can also make analysis on the basis of these data. This brings me to the last example I will get into, where we have not produced an experimental product, but we made an experimental method in order to maintain a current statistical product of key importance. That is the monthly turnover in private businesses. It is, of course, of key importance in its own right as primary statistics, and also of key importance for our quarterly national accounts, and of key importance as a stratification variable in our statistical business register. In Denmark, as in many other countries, this statistics is based on the value-added tax data received from the tax or the customs on the legal unit level. So it's a very detailed microdata. We receive these data on a monthly basis, and we disseminate the turnover statistics also monthly. So the situation with us is that the frequency for declaring VAT differs depending on the size of your turnover in your business. The biggest enterprises, they must declare every month. The medium-sized enterprises declare on a quarterly basis, and the small enterprises need only to declare their VAT every half year. For Statistics Denmark, this means that around 80% of the turnover is declared in a normal situation every month. For the other enterprises where we do not have the information as observations every month, or who do not meet the deadline for the declarations, we impute a value for the months in between the actual declarations and observations. But we were highly challenged because of the COVID, because the government decided with immediate effect to extend the VAT payments in order to support the liquidity of private businesses during the COVID crisis. So the monthly declarations were extended with 1 month. The quarterly or half-yearly declarations payments, they were also extended with that frequency. So this had severe consequences for us. We were facing the risk of a very serious data gap, and the fact that our model for imputing the non-reported turnover, which is based on historical data, that would severely overestimate to a degree that we wouldn't know, and this would happen at the worst possible moment in time, where we really needed the timely data about the activity and the level of activity. So the solution to this, which was one of our biggest problems because of the COVID, where we were trying to work on 2 strands. First, we tried to reduce the data gap. We tried to have this approach of declare your VAT now but pay later. First, we tried to influence the legislation which was brought through our parliament within very few days. We did not have any success in that. Then we tried to influence the communication that the tax department was sending out to the enterprises, that they could declare now but pay later, and that was a rather limited success. And then we made an appeal to the enterprises via the media. I made a feature article in the leading Danish business newspaper, also explaining that during the COVID time, we would have a more service-oriented approach to enforcement, and that we really made an appeal for enterprises to make their VAT declaration and then pay later, because the policymakers, they really needed this information in order to steer the economic policy. Then we actually have been very fortunate that many enterprises, they actually have declared their turnover as normal. Then the other strand was to extend our imputation model. We quickly established a task force with participants from our short-term statistics team, our quarterly national accounts, and our methodology division, in order to identify for each activity groups where the adjustments to the non-reported VAT would be needed and by how much, and then to prepare a suite of possible manual correction factors which we could use within different activities depending on how they were affected by the COVID situation. And then assess at which level the turnover figures for, that was then March, could be disseminated, and that we have been doing for each month since. And actually what happened was, the result was that we have been able to publish our turnover figures at the level of detail that we normally do. And at the time we also normally disseminate it, so there has been no delay. And also we were able to maintain the consistency between the primary statistics and the quarterly national accounts, and to have the microdata available for stratification of samples from our business register. So let me finish off by mentioning a few factors of success and lessons learned from our work on experimental statistics and experimental methods. We have received a lot of positive feedback from the media, from policymakers, from even from also ordinary citizens, for our work on the experimental statistics and how we have communicated that via our website. Also, it was a very positive experience to work with our colleagues in the central bank and in the other government authorities that were providing also indicators that were disseminated at our website. So we, in that sense, assumed the role of being a hub of high frequency information relevant for the COVID situation. So firstly, we have used our network and our partnerships very actively. Also we've had some co-financing on this. We had no time for legislation on the statistical actions. So it was based on what we could agree with our partners and network about. Then the internal framework, we were able to work in a more agile way. And that was very, very efficient in the short run. So we shortened the development time very much, as we also saw in the example from the Census Bureau. What we see now is that as we have more material on our site for experimental statistics, these relatively handheld processes, they are not cost efficient anymore. So if we want to maintain this on a current basis, we need to have a more automated approach. Then we were able to gain access to new data sources. It seemed that we were relying very much on our good reputation for independence and for being competent in handling also sensitive data. And so that the other partners, they trusted that the data handling should take place with us. Then, of course, we have the fortunate situation that we have the microdata linking possibilities due to the situation of our many registers with full coverage, both of the population and the businesses. And that, of course, is a key to creating new insights without additional burden. With regard to leadership, we decided that we would have a much higher risk appetite than we would normally have. As somebody said, the statisticians are not born courageous. So we had to really communicate clearly to our staff that we were willing to take more risks than we would normally do. That, of course, also meant that we, due to the very short production times, we would need to reduce some of the controls we would normally do. And this also reminded about this discussion we had in one of the previous presentations about the quality, that clearly relevance and timeliness was key. And not accuracy. So you could say the perfect solution next year or even next month is simply not in demand. So it was really, what can you give to us within a week's time or in 2 weeks' time? And then to be transparent that these are not normal statistics. These are not produced according to not always to the normal standards, and that these should be used with caution. And these are, so to speak, prescriptive statistics that really you need to look carefully into how they have been produced. So also the documentation was something that we put together in a very transparent way and in a very quick way. So this concludes what I would present to you today, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Soren. I hope you're okay at the end. At the end there, it was a big bump, but thank you very much. I'd perhaps invite all the panelists to maybe unmute and come off back onto the video while we sort of open it up. But it really struck me there, Soren, that the amount of data that you have available to sort of use and measure these things is would have been really helpful for you. So I sort of, just as a quick question to you, while again I'll remind those in attendance, if they want to add any additional questions on the Q&A box, that would be great. I suppose my question, Soren, was around the access to that data. I mean, how many of those were sort of new data sources in perhaps response to this, or you said you had a lot of those already available to you and your colleagues?
Well, the access to the smart meter data on the electricity uses, that was something we had access to it previously, but we hadn't had really a big opportunity to use it. So then we took on really using it and to have the data delivered very frequently. Then we were the indicators that are produced, or the basic data that are produced in some other government agencies, for instance, within the Ministry of Transportation, that was new to us. Usage of the open data on the air traffic was new to us. The satellite positioning data on the cargo ships, that was something we have been just playing a little bit with in the beginning of this year. And then we saw that, well, this is now the opportunity for us to start working on that. Okay. Then we had two other areas we were working on, and that was in telecommunications data. And we simply could not, so that was in order to show the, or to analyze how people were moving around in order to analyze the spreading of the COVID disease. And there are so many restrictions and reservations among the telecom operators that it has only become operational quite recently, and we haven't yet disseminated anything about it.
Yeah, I can imagine there must be some concerns around some of the use of these data sets as well. Yeah. I'm conscious of the time. We've got about 9 minutes before the session automatically closes, and I know we had a couple of panel-related questions. Sorry to sort of draw us to those. I think I know Tony, I think, is not online, so I'll sort of read out the context of Tony's questions, perhaps open it to the panel if they had any observations. It's more around the issue of non-response and the reporting of some of these measures. I think that Tony mentioned sort of Tom, sort of your sort of question, sort of outputs as well. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, or any others on the panel about, you know, how do we capture some of this information, particularly in a survey sense, versus the more administrative data sources that Soren just described?
Yeah, it's quite a loaded question when I actually read through it. But let me try and answer it before the other panel members come in. From the Australian context, we do actually have screening questions in each of our questionnaire to establish whether the business is trading or not trading. So that's a start. And by the way, all these questionnaires are up on our website for each of the various waves, so anybody can go and have a look at it. As part of that screening process, we want to actually establish whether the non-response is due to whether they're operating or not, or whether, you know, if they're not operating, whether they're dormant or whether they're actually fully closed. And we do a number of checks in this regard. We check with our other survey activities as well about status. We also have excellent sources from the tax data as well. So, you know, these businesses have to remit returns to the tax department on a monthly basis. We have access to that, and in some cases on a fortnightly basis when it comes to payroll, we have access to that. So we've got so many sources to work with. So with that in mind, when we extrapolate the data, we're extrapolating it to the true population. That is, whether that the scope of the population is a trading population. So we are actually extrapolating it to the true denominator, is what I'm trying to say here. That you know, it's a trading denominator or non-trading denominator, or trading plus non-trading denominator, whatever. But having said that, really, I think we've enjoyed quite good response rates. And again, we put our response rates up there for each of the waves. I think since we've started the survey program, I think Australian businesses are a lot more compliant than probably other countries. We enjoy something in the order of between 50 and 70% responses. Okay. Response rate. Just a quick comment. I just want to tie that to, I think, the point that Sumit made, you know, which I think is an excellent question or comment from Sumit. And that's really about challenging the cultural norms of statisticians generally between, you know, the trade-offs of the various dimensions of quality. And my view is that the rapid surveys has certainly pushed the boundaries. And I equate that really to that metaphor about providing the approximate answer to the right question rather than the right answer to the question that's become approximate by the time we actually publish the data. So that's how I would actually sum up, you know, the sort of the climate we're in at this point in time.
No, thanks for that. We've got again, I'm sort of watching the time before the session closes. Maybe Cathy or Rikke or Soren, if you had any sort of final brief sort of observations either on that or anything else before I sum it up.
Yeah, maybe just a brief addition to what Tom just mentioned now, and in particular referring also to something Cathy talked about in terms of the possible. Once we start asking businesses about their perceptions, their outlook, etc., the issue of of the population answering becomes important. And Cathy, you mentioned that, well, possibly you are overestimating the enthusiasm because the businesses temporarily closed are less likely to have responded. And for me, it actually relates very much to the topic of communication, which has also come up in this panel. And I think we have to, as statisticians, go a little bit beyond saying, well, if you press this link, you can read the methodology, and here is the questionnaire, etc. And I think we need to be used to making these explanations together with the numbers in also layman's terms. It's part of a big communication task that statistical offices have around the world. So I just wanted to add that dimension to the excellent answer by Tom. Thanks.
Cathy, would any, or Soren, anything additional?
I would just add that I think both Tom and Soren have touched on it, and I don't know what your experience is at the ONS, but we have very limited access to data outside of our surveys. You know, we have tax data, but in the US it's quarterly or annual for very small businesses, and it's just not something we could lean on. And so I think Soren's experience when sort of policy turned that administrative data off in some sense, it is something that that we've grappled with here too, even at the quarterly level. And so that was sort of the impetus of doing a survey. But we do feel competition in the US, at least, from companies, from private companies that have access to huge amounts of data and have decided to enter in the measuring the economy. So we're very aware of that and looking to partner. But it's just different here since we're not as cooperative or with in the US. So I'll leave it at that.
I'm just like to make one reflection, and that is we're now 6 months into this situation, and it seems to we cannot see the end of it. So I think we need to think about how we will follow up with statistics on the recovery, especially for those enterprises where we do not have a lot of information from ongoing or the usual surveys that we conduct, because there we will find it in the larger enterprises and in our records on the employment and so on. But I think we need to understand the dynamics of what is going on in those enterprises we do not know very much about. And there it has been very inspirational for me to see the other three examples there, and we will look into the possibilities of making surveys among the smaller enterprises, because normally we have taken them out of our surveys because during normal times we can rely on what we have in the registers, but suddenly we see a big information gap about the big majority of those enterprises that are small. So that's been very inspirational to hear. Thank you.
No, I think that's right. I think the experience by size band of business is something that in the UK we're also looking at closely as well. That brings us extremely close to our deadline. I mean, it's been a fascinating set of talks. I'd like to thank you all for your time and also the audience participation. There's a couple of questions that we didn't get to at the end, but I'd like to remind everybody about the break in the lounge that's coming up if you also have a chance to sort of chat outside this session. I know it's been the first day of the conference, but it's been fascinating, like I say, so far. And thanks again to you all, and also for the organisers for facilitating this in such a dynamic way that we can be across the globe talking about these issues that are really relevant to us all. So thank you to all the speakers again. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.